Hey, Miguel Iturrate back here on the Cage Rage podcast, and we're looking at MMA history in this latest edition of the Cage Rage podcast. I'm joined by teammate Devin Miller, and what we wanted to do is we wanted to choose a UFC that had Devin's attention last decade. I think UFC 60 is the one that jumped out at us, a real historic UFC headlined by Matt Hughes against Royce Gracie. And I think for, younger fans, because I was already, had been around and seen all the UFCs before that and, knew what was going on in the business. But I think for younger fans, that's a UFC that many people remember and remember as, possibly the first super fight they saw or the first time you were starting to get. I did some research. The fight nights, they'd had a fight night a couple of weeks before. It was UFC Fight Night 4. So the fight nights had just started. You were starting to get shows on Spike TV. The reality show may have been starting to pop up around this time frame and stuff. So there was a lot going on there. Dev, what do you remember about UFC 60? Matt Hughes versus Royce Gracie, first off, is the main event.
Well, this was actually the very first pay-per-view that I ever watched live. It was actually the first live event with the UFC that I got together with some buddies. We threw in on the card, and at the time, I was about 14 years old, and I remember getting the money from my mom and going over to my buddy's house, and we're going to throw in, and we were excited. And as you mentioned, the Ultimate Fighter series the first Ultimate Fighter season had just wrapped up, and on the pay-per-view previously that I didn't watch live, you had another returning vet, Tito Ortiz, fighting the first Ultimate Fighter winner, Forrest Griffin, and then you had the big, just super hype. And this is back in the day when there wasn't as many pay-per-views as there is today, so there was like 6 or 7 weeks sometimes between pay-per-views. There was a lot of hype leading up with Hughes and Gracie, and Matt Hughes was this very dominant current champion in the sport, and it was really the perfect fight that not only got people really interested in what was going on right now in the UFC with the current champions and learning about Matt Hughes and getting excited about his fight, but with bringing in Royce Gracie right after the Ultimate Fighter series, which probably did more to expand the popularity of the sport than anything did. People were learning about the origins of the sport. We're learning about Royce Gracie, who he was, how did he fight, and then you go and you learn about how the first UFC was very style versus style, and you're learning about the different disciplines, and you're learning about jiu-jitsu, and you're learning about it. It was a fight to me that really did a lot to educate the average casual fan to the sport of mixed martial arts, and I think that's why they did it.
And that's kind of cool to hear, because the bottom line is in 2006, you're talking about 13 years of UFC history, MMA maybe a little more in the modern era or wherever you want to time it from, but 13 years of UFC history, and it was starting to pay off here, because, and you look at the card, prior, as you stated, the UFC 59, it was just 6 weeks before. So, and you also had Arlovsky taking on Tim Sylvia there, which means that in that mix was also Randy Couture, and the UFC had a certain level of heyday that they'd never seen before already by then. You start from the 2001 sale where it went from Rob Meyerowitz to the Zuffa people and Dana White, and by 5 years into it, which is where we are now, the company's ready. They're ready to deliver. They're ready to deliver a big show, and UFC 60 had that feel. The return of Royce Gracie is something that you can't really underestimate the importance of here, and the investment there. And in a way, it's Royce and the UFC almost coming together for the good of the sport. And the reason I refer to that is because Royce Gracie left the UFC as soon as they started having rules. The rule that he didn't like is basically the rounds. He preferred a no-time fight. If he had you on the floor, he didn't want a time limit to run up and stand you up, and then he's got to get you on the floor again. So he never returned after the time limits in the rounds started to come in. Forget all the other rules and stuff. So, and now, not to mention fighting without a gi and things like that. So the return of for Royce to come back and actually do this meant a lot, and it also meant that maybe, he was going to show what he showed, which to me is that, his style and what he was prepared for was already a different sport.
I mean, when Gracie left, like as you said, it was no holds barred, no time limit, and when he comes back, the sport's so much more modernized and so much more structured with the rounds and the rules, and you know that is an interesting perspective. Another thing to consider with these two is it was Brazil versus America. When up at this point, besides Arlovsky that's coming to mind, pretty much all of the notable UFC stars were either American or Brazilian. You got Royce Gracie early in the early days, and then Frank and Ken Shamrock. You've got Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, Vitor Belfort, Vanderlei Silva. I mean, all these were either Brazilian or they were American. So you had like the cultural thing with you learn about Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I remember finding out oh, well, that's why there's so many Brazilians. Until I started watching MMA, I never seen and knew about so much about Brazil and Brazilians, because America doesn't have too big of a soccer audience. So MMA was what really brought South America to the States, through jiu-jitsu. And it was just for somebody that's like a nerd like me, learning about Royce Gracie and learning about the origins of the sport and learning about jiu-jitsu, because that was the first thing I wanted to train after I got into it, is I wanted to learn jiu-jitsu, because it was very clear to anybody who has a brain that watched those early UFCs that the most effective discipline seemed to be jiu-jitsu, that this little guy was beating these massive men and tapping them all out. And this was back before just the casual people didn't have any kind of understanding of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So, you know, I'd wrestle with my friends. I was learning how to do arm bars. I was learning how to do sweeps and triangles. And I was tapping all of them like, man, this stuff's effective. And I remember just thinking man, all this came from the Gracies. And there was just so much history for just 13 years of a sport, that it seemed like there was just this depth of story. There's such a depth of story there behind that name, Royce Gracie, and I had never even heard of him before.
Yeah, I think it is, like I said, two different perspectives. But I can tell you, coming up and seeing it, especially the first time you see, the pay-per-view, where you're getting a guy in a white T-shirt doing somersault kicks and stuff like that, if you remember Harold Howard and stuff. So it was definitely something new and something wild that was on pay-per-view, kind of like as a pay-per-view gimmick viewed as first. But once you started looking at it, and once, it really became a little bit of structured, I think Coleman may have been the first guy, along with Vitor Belfort and some of those guys, that really started to professionalize the sport, where they came for something and they kind of dedicated themselves to this. And, even Don Fry was a fireman before that, you know what I mean? So once you had guys full-time, it made a difference. And the jiu-jitsu guys were full-time. So for every guy that was there, I can tell you this, for the Royce Gracies and for those in Brazil, it was very deep, and there were a lot of guys that aren't stars, that will never be stars, that never had a chance at being stars. But once you got there and you saw the depth of it, that's when I thought, this is going to be big. This is going to be big, because there's just too much going into it, and they're too advanced already. The fighters were way advanced fast before you get to it, before the press attention and things like that. There were guys that were ready to go, you know what I mean? So I found that to be interesting, and I don't know that at that point in time, in 2006, if Brazil would have put Royce Gracie forward as their full representative, because Royce was older, and because, in the Brazilian community, I do think he has a great place of respect, much deserved, but I do think that they also knew he had some limitations. As he aged, they know he got slow. I know that from inside people. And, Hughes was able to exploit that pretty well.
Yeah, it was. And, that's another thing that was so amazing to see, was in the aftermath, when you've seen how bad Hughes won that fight, and how dominant he looked over this guy who at one point was beating everybody. And then you started learning about the time frame, about how long, just 13 years, how much the sport had evolved and how much it was evolving. And, since then the sport's not the same as it was just, we're about 13. That's interesting to think about it. So we're about 13 years from this fight, and it was about 13 years from Gracie's debut. So this is like right in the middle of what we've seen in the 26 years in the UFC. And when we consider what it was when Hughes and Gracie came compared to with UFC 1, compared to UFC 60, compared to what we just saw last weekend on UFC 235, the sport's been just evolving so much, and it's really incredible. But this was definitely like a turning point in the sport, and we seen definitely quite the rapid of evolution come out of this fight, I think.
Yeah, just to give the rest of the card props for UFC 60, because it was like one of those cards where, some guys were known. Everybody, to get to the UFC, you had to have a reputation, right? But still, there was nobody was a major star at this point. But later on down the line, you get some people who were stars. Obviously, you had Hughes and Gracie. The co-feature was Dean Lister, who really didn't do much in MMA, but is a force on the grappling scene. Alessio Sakara, which gives you the foreign feel, a foreign fighter, an Italian. With striking prowess, really. So, that was them making their foray into foreign fighters. You had Diego Sanchez, the tough one winner. Here he's facing John Alessio on his opening run, which was very strong. You had Brandon Vera winning. He was eventually a heavyweight contender and a guy that came from the Abu Dhabi tournament. So did Dean Lister, really. You had Swick and Riggs, which was two guys that came up on the West Coast, I think. And both guys... Swick more of a Midwest guy, Riggs on the West Coast, but I never worked with either of them. I did work with Chael, Sonnen, and Jeremy Horn. Horn and Sonnen fought as a preliminary bout. You had Spencer Fisher and Matt Wyman, Gabriel Gonzaga. Gonzaga, went on. This might be Gonzaga's debut at the UFC. And he went on to knock out Crow Cop, and he had like a 30, 20-something fight career. And then the opening fight was Melvin Guillard against a guy we worked with named Rick Davis, too. So... they were pulling in fighters from all over the place. The Brazilians are there. You had a Brazilian versus Brazilian match on the undercard. You had the Italians showing up, and you were starting to get an idea, a glimpse of what the UFC could be. It's still very much, if you look back at it, it's still very much an old-time card. 9 fights total. Now the UFCs are consistently 13 fights, et cetera, et cetera. But it is you can see matchmaker Joe Silva's work, because it is a pretty carefully constructed match-made card, including Hughes and Gracie was the right guy. Talk about what Hughes meant to you. Had he done the cowboy entrance yet?
He was coming out to Country Boy Can't Survive, and he, leading up to this fight, the UFC was doing, and I feel like this is something that's just been lost with, the fact that cable companies are not as powerful as they once were. Everything's on demand. They've got Fight Pass now, so people who want to see this stuff and see the history can go on there. But back then, I remember, before the days of Netflix and streaming and Fight Pass and all that, we had the DVR UFC Unleashed to watch these fights. And leading up to this, not only were they having hour-long specials of Royce Gracie fights, they were having specials of Matt Hughes' fights, and we were catching everything from his slam of Carlos Newton against the cage to his fight with Hayato Sakurai to his fight with Joe Riggs, his first fight with George St. Pierre that he armbarred him in. So much history that was there. With and of course the Frank Trigg fights, which were epic, and Matt Hughes was probably at this time the most decorated champion. I think Chuck Liddell had just recently knocked out Randy Couture to win the title, so I'm not even sure he even had a defense. I think he defended. That was the third fight because I think he won it the second. Yeah, so Chuck Liddell only had 1 or 2 title defenses at the time. Rich Franklin was pretty new still, and I think the heavyweight title picture was going back and forth between Tim Sylvia and Andre Arlovsky. So Matt Hughes was the most dominant champion at the time, and the smallest weight class the UFC had at this time was the welterweight division. So Hughes was actually the smallest champion because they hadn't opened back up to 55, and they definitely didn't have 45 or 35. And So Hughes seemed like this dominant current champion at the time, and he was 100% just, he was the American for sure in this fight. Like he was just, he had this stick as just being the country boy, and
it was the right time to play that patriotism angle for sure with Matt. And Matt was the right guy to do it, because at the end of the day, Matt is really the strong silent type. He's not like a Colby Covington who's going to piss off half the room, you know what I mean? He was the strong silent type that didn't have a lot of naysayers, especially at that superstar level. The bottom line is Hughes was, as you pointed out, all those wars in the UFC, was already a decorated champion. And, he was definitely a guy who studied the sport, because he came in with a wrestling background. I remember when he came up and he showed up at Monty's show. I'm not sure if it was his debut, but within his first 3 fights, he fought UFC champion Dave Mene. Mene was already a known quantity, and that's when Dave Mene lost on a smaller show, it was like, whoa, who just beat Dave Mene? And that's where Matt Hughes come from. Matt Hughes put in the miles on smaller shows, and he did always. I remember it wasn't on Hook and Shoot, because he never really did anything with me directly. But I remember he would solicit our tough guys for fights. He was, I'll fight him. If you need somebody to fight him, I'll fight him. And it wasn't about money. It wasn't about any of that sort of stuff. It was about learning what he was doing. He put in the work coming in with Jeremy Horn and stuff. It's interesting to me on UFC 60 that Jeremy Horn is on that card, because I'm almost certain he would have had to have been in Hughes'. So he fought, beat Chael Sonnen, and then went out and worked Hughes' corner. I'm not even looking at the fights. I haven't seen them to do this recap, but I'm sure that's the way it went, because Jeremy Horn was a force back then. You mentioned the Carlos Newton fight, just rambling here, but I was probably within 20 feet of all that action, everything that went on there, because I was in that building with a press pass standing there. And I can tell you this, I think the official ruling on that fight is that Carlos Newton won the world title, and that when the triangle took out Hughes, Hughes fell, and Newton went out awkwardly afterwards because he landed hard, but the first guy out was Hughes. And one of the things that saved the day there was Hughes gets up, and Hughes is confused, and I remember it clear as day. Jeremy Horn comes up to him and says, "You won the fight." And Hughes gets up, and he kind of puts his arms up, and it kind of went from there. But if they had actually really looked at it, I don't know that the ruling goes that way, because it was a very confusing moment. Newton, to me, is one of the early guys who was just, again, one of the guys where you see a guy like Carlos Newton, you go, this is going to be big. You know what I mean? This fighting thing is going to be big, because, not everybody was, Thomas Ramirez or, one of those guys that was in, an afterthought, now. But there were some guys, and Hughes, in that time, was a superhero through those fights. And he was in the right place at the right time. I know around that time, I think the UFC was also starting to really throw money around with bonuses and things. And him as a decorated champion, there were actually behind the scenes, I don't know if you want to call them battles or whatever, but he was getting advised by certain people to leave his longtime manager, Monty Cox. And I mean, at the end of the day, Monty had him when he was making $300 a fight. And, some of those contracts, I don't know what Monty made for that, 20%, 30%, but, you start looking at a manager, you start getting a payday that's $1 million, and you start having to give $200,000 now to a manager who maybe used to get, if you made $30,000, you got to give him 20. He made $6,000. He worked his ass off for a couple of months. Okay, it's not the end of the day. Now you're going to give away $200,000. There were a lot of changes going on around this time as the UFC exploded.
Yeah, and that's a lot to take in there, man. That's
Sorry.
Yeah, you got such a good, you have a really good background story into all these fighters. And the one thing that I know about Jeremy Horn, I didn't know him personally. I wasn't really even following MMA around that time. It's just the fact that you look at guys from that era and just the different breed of athlete, of fighter this man had 125 fights.
Yeah, Jeremy to me is a guy, you have to look at it this way. He was very young, and this was his sport, so he's like you at 12, 13, he's got into arm bars and stuff. And before that, I think he'll tell you he was kind of a nerdy kid, not an athlete. And he wasn't like a super athlete. He was a smart fighter, right? So this was his sport, and it showed because he was the guy, like I've mentioned in previous podcasts too, who would show up at fights Thursday night, drive 2 hours, go to fights Friday night, ref Saturday night's fights just to help out and that sort of stuff. Horn was that guy, and by the time he got associated with Monty Cox and Matt Hughes, now you're taking a guy who wants to drink this stuff up, and you're giving him access to guys like Pat Miletich, guys like Matt Hughes with their superior wrestling. That camp was, with the Miletich camp, which he was associated with early, was just a hotbed with guys that never made the UFC that were, great wrestlers. Robbie Lawler was one of those guys in the early days back then, and guys of that level. Jason Black, nobody will remember Jason Black, but tough dude. And, it was, and Jeremy gravitated toward that. I could tell you a Matt Hughes and Jeremy Horn story. They both showed up at the last Abu Dhabi that was held in Abu Dhabi, and they tried a little bit of shenanigans there where they wound up having to fight each other in the bracket. And they actually wound up having to fight each other where the loser would be out, and the winner would actually be in the money. So, and Hughes went on to battle Tito Ortiz in a great fight after that. So, so what they decided to do to make some money and maybe throw Horn a bone was Hughes kind of judo throwed him and choked him and submitted him in like 20 seconds, 15 seconds. So they've had the fastest submission of the night. But the Brazilian group, led by Renzo Gracie, said, not so fast. That doesn't look good. And if you look at that particular one, the fight of the fastest submission of the night went to Renzo Gracie. And I forget which one of his teammates he got very fast, but it was all predicated on Matt and Horn, trying to make a little money. I'm not begrudging them or trying to put them down for that. The reason I mention it is just to show that they already had a really special relationship, because I'm talking about 2001. Right. So by 2006, these guys were, training partners for a long time and very good friends. So it's hard, that's hard to go up against, too, an established guy on his show as the champion. Royce was facing a mountain.
Yeah, and they made it to the big show together. And it's interesting that when we discussed covering this card, you brought up Jeremy Horn, and I asked who his opponent was, and his opponent was Chael Sonnen. And Chael Sonnen wasn't even really a big name at this time. The first time I remember seeing Chael Sonnen as a legit name in MMA, somebody to watch for, was at the WEC days when I saw him beating up Paulo Filho in the WEC days, and then he went on to become a huge star in the UFC and his big fights with Anderson Silva, and now he's a big big analyst for ESPN. And so this card had some names, and at the time, it just shows that some of these fighters could have been buried in those cards and didn't even really have the names, and then they were going to become who they became later on in their career. And Horn I'm seeing here that Horn actually beat Chael in the second round submitted him with an armbar.
I don't think it was the first time Chael lost to Horn. I think just Horn was a guy who was enough of a pro. He was ahead of the game on some of those guys. Sonnen too. Here in 2006, you have a completely different Chael Sonnen than the Sonnen that's in public now. And when I see the Sonnen that's in public now, I'm very happy for him but I think you see, the bad guy and stuff like that. I think it is a contrived thing. I think it's not something that came easily to him. I think he's puts a lot of effort into his bad guy personality. That's all good because he figured out how to make money. But back then, Sonnen was the kind of guy that he was hanging around with like Matt Lindland's team and the group out of Oregon that were wrestlers. He's very wrestler based, obviously, in his style. Especially he has a good posture in your guard, and he can hit the heck out of you, even while you're in guard. So that was his bread and butter, posture and hit you hard in the early days, and just count on your wrestling. So he could be submitted and stuff. He was always adamant about not liking the clown aspect of it or the show aspect of it, but somewhere along the line the message got through, and he turned it into making money and stuff. He'd done the Abu Dhabis, like I said, he came from the Matt Lindland team with the wrestler base and stuff, so they always would be, at a disadvantage with some jiu-jitsu. And Horn was a guy who covered, who could operate in both angles. I'm not saying Horn is a black belt level jiu-jitsu guy or anything like that. But Horn, the level of work Horn has put in is certainly at that level. And he has an understanding of more than just jiu-jitsu or more and wrestling and stuff like that. Horn was a special guy there that is kind of an unheralded hero, you know, if you were really watching. Very responsible for Matt Hughes' reign. And in this case, you know, Chael, always a guy with a lot of physical potential, seemed to lose some of the big fights. That tournament with Paulo Field, if I'm not mistaken, did he lose to Forrest Griffin afterwards, or
he lost the first Paulo Field fight with an armbar, and then he won a decision, and then he lost to Damian Maia, and he lost both the Silva fights. He fought John Jones, but I did look that up, and that was actually his third. He was actually 0-3 against Jeremy Horn at UFC 60 time. So Chael Sonnen is actually a pretty cool story of perseverance, man. He stayed in there, got big fights with Anderson and John Jones, and he beat Michael Bisping. He beat Shogun Rua. You know, he fought Tito Ortiz and Vanderlei and Quentin Jackson and Fedor and Bellator. So I mean, he's been around the park, man, and he stayed in there even. But Jeremy Horn did beat him in 2004. He beat him in 2006 at UFC 60, and he beat him back. I saw another loss that he had here. I think 2 losses in 2004. Yeah, within just a few months' time, both to Jeremy Horn. So he went 0-3 against Horn.
Yeah, if you look around that time period, you look at the fights against like Armand Gambarian, the fights on Euphoria shows. Those are all fights I match made with Chael. So I mean, I know Chael pretty well, and Chael was always a smart guy. Like I can tell you, little mind games he played with the Russian team. We did a straight USA versus Russia show, and he was deliberately a pain in the ass. Like, didn't show up at weigh-ins and, like, sent this guy down. They were like, no, he's about to break, like, a video game record. So, like, he made sure that people knew he was playing video games and stuff. And I don't think that was the case, you know. But the Russians definitely took him lightly, and they had an exchange in the ring right before that fight started that Chael winked at him, and it was like, oh no, he fooled me. I'm the matchmaker. I'm like, get this fucking guy down here. You know what I mean? And you know, he showed up. He kind of winked at the Russian and took him out. You know, did his job real well. So he was in the game, and he was always on. Once the competition started, Chael was always very confident in himself. So I'm glad that confidence extended itself rather to his persona stuff, because, you know, I think that showed. You know, you had him doing hard fights before, amounting to, you know, taking home your paycheck and grumbling about it. And now you open your mouth a little bit and you wind up on ESPN and you have, you know, your thousands of followers and YouTube channels and all the kind of stuff that he's reaping the benefits. So, you know, Chael learned, but yeah, you had a real young, I mean, like I said, this was a preliminary fight at UFC 60. So you had a real young Chael Sonnen at that point.
Yeah, and I think before we wrap this up, we should throw a bone toward Diego Sanchez, especially considering what we just seen at UFC 235 over the weekend, that he's back in the win column on a 2-fight win streak, and he's still doing it even here going on 13 years later. And Kenny Florian was his first fight for the Ultimate Fighter finale, and he beat Josh Koscheck and Alex Karalexis on the show on the very first Ultimate Fighter season, and then he pulled off the finale win over Kenny Florian, then won against Brian Gasaway and Nick Diaz, and then he was fighting John Alessio on this card and pulled off a win. So at this time right now, Diego Sanchez was unbeaten in everything he did as a pro and was looking like he could be the next big star at that division, especially considering he was fighting at the same division at the time that Matt Hughes and Gracie were. And Matt Hughes was a champion at welterweight. They have Diego, the first Ultimate Fighter winner that was coming up. So Diego was just a young gun at this time.
Yep. It's crazy because, you know, we just talked about Chael Sonnen and went into a little bit about how his act has completely changed. With Diego, you're talking about a guy whose act is exactly the same right now, you know, 13 years later. He still, you know, has to get himself mentally up for a fight and hyped up. And, you know, in a very expressive fashion, like where, you know, you kind of got to leave him alone and let him do his thing kind of thing. You know what I mean? It's got to make the opponents wonder the whole thing. But it's worked for him because he's there 13 years later. There's very few fighters that are still active off of this card, and Diego is one of them. And different from Chael, with all due respect to Chael, but different from Chael, Diego's still in active, real UFC competition. I mean, I know Chael's coming off. You can't say Fedor's an easy fight or anything like that, but Chael is more in the geriatric circuit right now with Bellator and with some of those guys, whereas, Diego's still in the fight. Diego, if you get Diego on the right day, Diego will tell you how he still wants to fight for a championship, probably. So, yeah, you're looking at an anomaly there, and he's early in his career, but I think you mentioned it on a previous podcast. I'm all for it. Diego Sanchez should be in the UFC Hall of Fame, no doubt.
Yeah, I agree, and it's somewhat of a shame for Diego in his career that he was so overshadowed with that first Ultimate Fighter. Like, I think a lot of people, when they think of the first Ultimate Fighter season, they instantly think of Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar, because that was such a pivotal fight for them at the time, because, as I mentioned on the podcast several times, that I really feel the UFC did a very smart move by creating the Ultimate Fighter right at the height of reality TV popularity. But they did two divisions, so they ended up with two winners, Forrest Griffin and Diego Sanchez. And the big story of the night, without a doubt, was the Griffin Bonnar fight at the end. That was just legendary. And really, in reality, Diego Sanchez his longevity, when you consider Josh Koscheck and Chris Lieben and Kenny Florian and Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar and him, all these fighters that came out from that season, who's still there and who's not. Diego Sanchez is the only one left.
Yep.
And here he is still left, and he won that season. He beat Kenny Florian. He's been in there with a lot of great guys. He had title fights. I guess Forrest Griffin was the only one that went on to become a world champion, but he never defended the belt. He beat Quentin Jackson and then lost his first defense to Rashad Evans. And after his fight with Anderson Silva, he pretty much destroyed his career. But Diego Sanchez has been somebody who, here we are going on, we're in 2019, and he's on a winning streak.
Nobody really could derail his career, even, though he took losses, and there were times where he looked like his star was down. So, yeah, he really deserves credit. I think also, and we can close on this, but I think also what you're seeing here in the UFC, and keep in mind now, 13 years later, you're seeing the UFC basically with weekly shows. And to get there from a show every 6 weeks and stuff, but you are starting to see the UFC ramp up around the UFC 60 time. They're starting to have the fight nights. They're starting to have the reality show. The reality show's been a success in creating stars. You can see them starting to build the roster as well, because the bottom line is you wanted to win the reality show because the reality show meant you got a bigger contract. But everybody got on the show, basically, and forget about, there's stuff that, I won't even remember the guy's name, but if you look at season 1 of the reality show, there was a guy on the show that never fought before, never fought again, and many people believe he was an actor. And he's the guy who fought Chris Lieben to get Lieben his first fight, because the bottom line is Lieben was an attractive personality, but he lost every fight. He shouldn't have even been on the show, but they kept bringing him back. They had to get him a win. He was a Canadian kid who's still 0-1 on Sherdog or something along those lines, So, yeah, there was a lot of, machines being put together to move them to where they are now. But what you're seeing there is they're ramping up. They're starting to build up the roster. The TV show brings in more talent. They have to put in more shows. They now have shows that are not just on pay-per-view. So it's starting to build, and that was 13 years ago. So, with that said, Dev, I'll give it to you. UFC 60, what's your final thoughts?
Well, the only thing I guess we didn't really cover with the whole historical landscape of this card, and about how the UFC was blowing up at the time right now, really expanding, and it is kind of interesting. You see the early days with UFC 1, 2, 3, and Gracie in those early days, and then you propel forward to like the UFC 50, UFC 60 range, and all that, and I think it's important to note that this was expanding after the quote unquote dark ages of MMA that happened somewhere in between there, where MMA was banned on pay-per-view. It was definitely not broadcast on national TV, and a lot of that changed with the entrance of somebody like Matt Hughes, and when they became more structured, got sanctioned, got weight classes, BJ Penn, Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, these guys came in there. They started, the sport started looking very legit. And I would be interested to hear like your take on it, because I know that you were around during those days, like, and that you were heavily involved in MMA at a time when it was hard to even get it on pay-per-view, and then you start seeing it really expanding, you know, around like the UFC 30 times with, like, we brought up Hughes and Carlos Newton, and then it's really growing by the time we're at UFC 60 with Hughes and Gracie. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on the supposed dark ages of MMA in America.
Well, I think, look, by the time you got to UFC 60, it's 2006. So the Fertittas came aboard in 2001, and with the Fertittas and Dana, you're talking about a triumvirate of people that, you know, the whole sport really needs to thank, because, you know, the bottom line is a lot of guys are billionaires. There are a lot of billionaires, right? But how many billionaires really are going to want to go ahead and really put what these guys did into it to get it to that point? And they did supposedly invest $30-40 million to be in the hole. Before that, that doesn't get done by just anybody. That gets done by guys with passion. And these guys, they combine that with a lot of what Vegas brings, which is showy legitimacy and stuff like that, but a lot of connections and things. So the things they were able to do, such as get the attention of boxing commissions, such as start to be able to present it, even if it was just on Spike TV, start to be able to present yourselves to television and to be on those sort of things. You needed them to also not only have, you know, take care of the fighters and do that sort of stuff. They needed to be working on a corporate level, and they were the only company doing that. You know what I mean? Everybody else was still, you know, thinking, oh, we could get this fighter or this, you know, and it was that ability to start thinking way ahead. Because the Spike TV contract, that's immeasurably big, because that's where the reality show would be. That's where eventually they'd be showing live fights on free television. You know, that's basically how the star of Forrest Griffin was built, was on that fight, which was on free television on Spike TV. Now they're not even on Spike, because Spike's a small channel, and they're on way bigger channels and way bigger deals now. You don't get to the big corporate deals they're at now without laying the groundwork, and that's where you were in UFC 60. I'll give you now to close, but like the Reebok deal, which gets so poo-pooed, you know, this is the way I see that working, okay? It's a 6-year deal for something like $80 million. That's what it was, or something along those lines. Even the numbers are wrong. They're numbers in that ballpark. They're low numbers. People started dividing the numbers up and how many main events, and basically the champions get like $40K or something like that, and, you know, people made more getting, you know, hunting clubs to sponsor them on their T-shirts. You know what I mean? So, you know, why does that deal become important? Because, you know, if Reebok over these 6 years does really well with this, and the re-up comes, or if Adidas wants to come and say, hey, you know, we could do better in Reebok. Those guys used to misspell the fucking names on their shirts. You know what I mean? And they come and say, look, you know, that 6-year, $70 million deal is now 6 years, $700 million. And that type of explosion on deals is, you know, that's what's happening in the NBA, that's what's happening in the NFL, and that's where the UFC took you, to corporate world, you know? So there is the potential that the Reebok deal, the fact that they're in uniform, the fact that everybody now looks the same and stuff like that, will pay off in the long run in such a form that it will make sure that everybody's getting, you know, 10 times the money now. So now a $40,000 check becomes a $400,000 check that's a nicer bonus for a champion. So, you know, I see that the beginning of the forward thinking there, and getting on TV and things like that. Those are the steps that, you know, got MMA to where it is today. And UFC 60 is a celebration. Even though it was a pay-per-view, it was a celebration of that, because you had TV stars that were built on TV, and the company had diversification. There was the 2 shows before, there was a fight night. In other words, not just pay-per-views anymore. And so it definitely was a historic show, and I like that you pointed out that's about the midway point from 93 to now that we're looking at. So I think UFC 60 overall definitely, you know, maybe perhaps one of the most 10 influential UFCs of all time.
Yep. So I mean, I guess just breaking it down and making it, just looking at what this fight meant. You know, this was to spell it out very quickly, and just to sum it all up, it was at a time that the sport was definitely, that you had the promotion clearly making a very big move for the sport. After the Ultimate Fighter, the sport's growing in popularity, and I wasn't in the boardroom. We can only speculate on it, but my guess is they assembled this fight as the perfect fight to have their most dominant champion fight their most legendary star, and because they knew that they're growing, people are growing in interest in the current state of the UFC, but that bringing Royce Gracie in is going to get people to look at the history that have been already. And this fight really does tie a lot together, and that the period from UFC 1 to UFC 60, and it made people interested in what happened in that span in between there, and I was one of them. So I think this fight, because this fight is what got me into a sport that I love, that I'm now covering here on the Cage Rage podcast, and it got me interested in learning about the history of this sport. And I really, Matt Hughes was the first dominant champion that I can remember in my viewing time, and Royce Gracie is as much of a pioneer as anybody that's ever been in the sport. So there's a lot that tied into this fight, and this has been a fun conversation covering it.
And yeah, likewise, just a little bit of a different perspective. I do think one of the other things that's important to give the UFC credit for here is I do think this fight also was a certain aspect of doing right by Royce, bringing him back for one more big payday. I don't know, what the paycheck was or how the deal came, but I do know that Royce was probably not going to come back for, the $50K he made for that first tournament. You know what I mean? So, that's also doing the right thing, and that also sends a message for longevity. And at that time, the business really liked those messages. They wanted to see that these guys are going to be around. And going back to take care guys, which they didn't always do, was the right thing to do. So with that, this has been the CRP's MMA History Podcast. I'm Miguel Iturrate. I've been joined by Devin Miller, and we've been talking in depth about the historical event, May 27, 2006, UFC 6.